Hello and welcome to Your Questions Answered with Father Gruner. I'm John Veneri. This program is where we take the questions that you send us, we discuss them, Father Gruner answers them. Continue please to email us your questions. You can see the address at the bottom of the screen, questions@thefatimacenter.com. Today we have what could be considered a controversial question, and that is, what are we to think of the upcoming canonizations of two popes, John the 23rd and John Paul II?
Well, I was reading in an interview that you just did, but I'd like to comment and say, what are we to think? I think, first of all, the first thing we have to think is good and evil is evil. What I mean by that is we cannot call evil good or good evil. So if there's going to be a canonization of a pope who's been rather less successful as being a pope than he could have been, then he can't be canonized for being a bad pope or being a inadequate pope. I mean, we've had popes in the past who've tried their best to placate the opposition. I'm thinking of, I just read about the case in 553 at a council, the Second Council of Chalcedon, and they made such a mess of it that the Pope Gregory the Great, 40 years later, said, just ignore that council, just pretend it never happened. And so Saint Gregory the Great is a canonized saint. He's proven to be a saint. I think that Pope John Paul and John 23rd are attached to this Vatican Council, and the Council itself has problems. And the Council, even though there are all sorts of people saying rah, 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 the Council, at the end of the day, we've had more confusion since the Council and because of the Council than before it. So if these two popes on some individual basis have a personal sanctity, it's not because of their attachment to the council or their defense of the council. It's got to be for some other title we don't know. I mean, I've heard, for example, that with John 23rd, that he was embarrassed by the council. And he was asking both Cardinal Heenan, I don't know who told me that story, and I do know who told me he was asking Cardinal Siri. Both of them, he was asking them, what can we do with the council? And on his deathbed, John 23rd was saying, Cardinal Siri is right. The council was a mistake. Now, on the basis of that, and I've heard also, from private sources, that John 23rd was poisoned. So now, I could see him being a personal martyr, trying to right a wrong that he himself was somewhat involved in, and therefore be a saint before God today. And when that story comes out, that's what should be the heroic sanctity of John 23rd. Okay. And so I think, but I'd like to hear what your take on. Professor.
Well, there's a couple, but even before we get to Professor Professor DeMattei, one of the things we have to keep in mind is the fact that the process of canonization itself has changed so radically.
Yes.
That the old system, William Thomas Walsh, the great historian, when he wrote about it he wrote about it before he died in the 1950s or something, and he said that no court of law examines the suspect, whatever, more thoroughly than the Roman court deciding whether someone will be a saint. And every objection to that's the sanctity of a person is examined and answered.
Yes.
Okay, so the whole process prior to the changes in the 1980s was more of a juridical structure that had lawyers, that had everything really locked in to prove a case. The change that took place, and there was something called the devil's advocate, whose job was to find out bad things about this man or woman who's put up for canonization, because the church did not want to put up someone for canonization who later on it was found out that had some problems. So in the new structure, they did away with the juridical structure and turned it, as one writer said, Kenneth Woodward said, it's more like the structure of examining a doctoral thesis. It doesn't have the very strong demands for proof, absolute demands for proof. And there was a lawyer, a canon lawyer, high-ranking Vatican canon lawyer, I can't remember his name, begins with a P, Monsignor, who wrote to John Paul II complaining about the new process, saying there is no more any room for an adversarial process. There's someone who really points out that there could be problems.
And that's why this question is important. Even what are we to think Well, since they're called into canonization, but it's not the same canonization process as before. We're left on our own. Is what
Yes, very much. What it does is it's introduced doubt,
yes.
and it's introduced people now having reservations about canonizations.
Yes.
One of the things that...
well, for example, I just heard of a case recently of a man examining the case of St. Pius X and the case of John 23rd. And one is all footnoted, bulletproof, no one can disprove him, it's all documented, everything else. The other one is just a lot of fluff.
Yeah,
you know, so that kind of
it's
thing.
put together. There seems to be more of a subjective will to get this person canonized rather than the canonization on its own merit.
Well, it brings it right back to the whole theory, the whole heresy, the whole sewer of heresies that modernism is. Modernism is all about subjective feelings. It's not about objective truth. And this process, the new process, is reflecting the modernists' feelings as distinct from the objective truth. I mean, if Padre Pio, raised a man from the dead, I met the man he raised from the dead, that's an objective fact. This guy was dead. He comes back to life 8 hours later when Padre Pio tells him to get up. So that's an objective fact. There's a miracle. This Padre Pio worked. But if somebody else says, well, he's a nice guy, he smiled at me, no doubt he smiled at a guy, but that's not something you can measure and say there's a miracle, okay? Another
thing now, Professor Di Mattei, Roberto Di Mattei, the Roman historian, when I did the interview with him, he pointed out, and he said this to me in private conversation too, that a person is canonized based on his state of life. So if they're looking to canonize a woman who was a mother of a family, they're not going to look at her fruits, her actions, the same way. They wouldn't judge her the same way they would judge a mother superior or someone like that. She had to fulfill her state in life and had to do it to a heroic degree and had to be an example to others. You want to know how to be a saintly mother? Look at her and do what she did. This is one of the reasons of canonization.
Yeah.
Now, this might scandalize some people, but we'll say it anyway. It has to do with Pope John Paul II's interreligious prayer meeting at Assisi. That took place in 1986. Now, around 2008, 9, 10, I'm losing the dates, when John Paul was beatified, I know you know the family too, a big homeschooling family,
yes.
And they all have blonde hair.
Yes.
And anyway, the 12-year-old boy was on a chat line with, now he's a traditional Catholic, goes to the old Mass, and he was talking to what you call conservative Catholics. They go to the new Mass and they don't have the same attitude of Vatican II that we have. But anyway, this 12-year-old said, well, the reason I have objections to the beatification of John Paul II is, well, here's one of the reasons, the prayer meeting at Assisi, he said to his friend of 12-year-olds, the prayer meeting at Assisi where John Paul II prayed in public with pagans, Buddhists, Hindus, rabbis, Muslims, Protestants, putting them all on the same level. The 12-year-old Catholics wrote back and said, that couldn't have happened. Impossible. You're lying and you're defaming John Paul II. So this 12-year-old got a picture of the Assisi meeting and he sent it to them online. They responded and said, that's a doctored photo. Somebody photoshopped John Paul II in that meeting. But here's the point. Those 12-year-olds, they knew.
Yes.
They knew this is not Catholic.
Yes.
They knew this is not heroic
Virtue.
example and virtue to be followed.
Yes.
So the problem is, and Bishop Fillet said this too, that when these objections are brought to the Vatican, it's not that they answer and say, you're wrong, they just ignore them.
Yes.
And so it's left a lot of people, we could talk about this for a long time, but it's left a lot of people forced to have doubts and reservations. I certainly have reservations.
So that's why we're asked this question. What are we to think?
Yeah.
Well, what we're supposed to think is we have to uphold the good, we have to uphold the true, we have to uphold the virtuous. So when something is not virtuous, such as having a pope or a priest or a cardinal or whatever else going to a meeting with Protestants and with Zoroasters and the Great Thumb, whatever they call themselves, and anybody else, this is not to say that somehow or other these people can't become Catholic, can't be converted, can't be pleasing to God one day, but in their present state, they're not pleasing to God. Now, God knows their heart, but what they're saying and doing publicly is not the right thing. They're not honoring God by their false religions. And to say otherwise is to say a falsehood.
Or to give the impression otherwise. You know full well, because I remember old Father Wickens telling me in this, he says, when we were in the seminary, we were told that as priests, we not only have to avoid scandal, we have to avoid the appearance of scandal.
Yes.
And Assisi, this is just one thing, was a tremendous scandal that Pope John Paul II went to his grave defending and praising. So this raises tremendous problems. Canonizations.
You say Assisi, of course, we're talking about the event in Assisi.
Yeah, the Assisi event.
Not
not St. Francis of Assisi.
Yeah.
So, and canonizations, Professor Dematteis point out, and Bishop Fillet, and also Father Hess said this too, it's kind of in a second degree. It's not really pronouncing on matters of faith and morals. That's really the first degree of infallibility. But this pronouncement of canonizations is in another category. And what's the name of the theologian in Rome? Guardini.
Guardini, the one who wrote on Second
Yeah,
Vatican Council.
Guardini. I mean, he's one of the last of the Roman theologians, and he is arguing that the canonizations are not necessarily infallible.
Yeah.
So anyway, we look to the truly canonized saints, such as St. Pius X and others, for heroic example. And we pray, when I wrote about it, I said, the problem is so great that we really need a Garrigou-Lagrange or a Robert Bulliman to take us through it all.
Yeah.
But I would say, that it is legitimate to have doubts and reservations about these canonizations.
Don't look to them, either one of them, for heroic, as the story is to today. I mean, in the case of John 23rd, if he died a martyr trying to get out of the council, then one could say that, there's other martyrs who've died martyrs who made mistakes before, who corrected themselves under pain of martyrdom. And I could say John 23rd. If he's canonized for that, we can look at that. But not for the council itself.
But the general consensus is, and I think this is pretty obvious, this push to put these really great virtuous people on the back burner, and someone like Catherine of Aragon and Father Baker and things like that, and push these two popes for canonization is really, the goal is to canonize this modernist orientation of Vatican II. That if you oppose this, well, you have St. John Paul II as an icon of it, so how could you oppose it? And he's
not saint yet, number one. Yeah. And even two, he can't be saint for Vatican II.
Yes. So anyway, we've gone over, but it's a big question to answer in a short amount of time. So if you have any more questions about it, please send it to us at questions@thefatimacenter.com, and we will see you on tomorrow's broadcast.